The whisper in the alley, the alien city, was quiet. Too quiet. As if it was holding its breath. The war had ended months ago, but the streets still smelled of smoke and fear. Shadows stretched long between broken buildings, and the night air was cold enough to bite. Ethan Cole, a lone human traveler, walked with steady steps. His boots crunching on scattered glass. He kept his head low, his hood up, and his eyes alert. Humans were not welcome here, not anymore. He had come to this place to trade for supplies, nothing more. But something about the silence felt wrong. Too many empty windows, too many dark corners. It was the kind of place where trouble waited patiently for you to make a mistake. He turned down a narrow side alley to avoid a group of alien guards ahead. The walls were close here, and the air smelled of damp stone. Halfway through, he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it. Footsteps, light and quick. Following him, Ethan slowed his pace. Pretending he hadn't noticed, his hand slid into his coat. Fingers brushing the hilt of the small blade he always carried. Then it happened. A tiny tug on his sleeve. Gentle but desperate. He turned and saw her, a small alien girl. No older than 7. Her skin was pale blue with faint silver markings. Her big violet eyes wide with fear. She was shaking. Clutching the edge of his coat as if letting go would mean falling into darkness. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. Like a leaf in the wind, Ethan blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. "Please, human. Be my father and my mom's partner," she said, her words quick and urgent. For a moment, Ethan just stared at her. It was the last thing he expected to hear in this cold, dangerous place. "What?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The girl glanced over her shoulder, her small body tensing. "They'll take her away. If you don't come," she whispered again. Her hands gripped his arm tighter. Ethan could hear distant voices, now heavy, harsh, in a language he didn't know. They were getting closer. Whoever she was running from, they were looking for her. Ethan had a rule: never get involved in places like this. Getting involved meant getting killed. But there was something in her eyes, something raw, pleading, and filled with a fear no child should carry. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "All right. Lead the way," he said. She didn't wait another second, grabbing his hand. She pulled him deeper into the maze of backstreets. Her steps were quick, her small frame slipping easily between piles of rubble. Ethan followed, his senses sharp. Scanning for danger, the city here was worse, the buildings more broken. The streets darker. Every now and then, she'd glance up at him, as if to make sure he was still there. "What's your name?" he asked quietly as they moved. "Leary," she said without looking back. "And your mom?" "Kelra. She's sick," Leary replied, her voice breaking slightly. Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about escaping someone. This was about survival. They turned down an even narrower alley. Somewhere behind them, the voices grew. Louder, more urgent. Ethan could hear the sound of armored boots striking the ground. "They're close," Leary whispered. She led him to a wall covered in torn posters and broken metal sheets. Before he could ask what they were doing, she pushed on a small, hidden panel. It creaked open to reveal a narrow passage between 2 buildings, barely wide enough for Ethan to fit inside. "Quick," she said, her small hands shoving at his arm. Ethan slipped inside. The girl right behind him. The passage was dark, the air heavy with dust. They moved in silence until it opened into a small, dimly lit courtyard. A single doorway stood ahead, light spilling from the cracks around it. "This is where she is," Leary said softly. Ethan hesitated. This could be a trap, but the way her voice trembled made him believe otherwise. He followed her to the door, his hand ready on his blade. Inside was a single room, warm but worn. A thin blanket hung over a window, and the smell of boiled herbs filled the air. On a low bed in the corner, an alien woman lay half-sitting. Her breathing slow and tired. Her skin was the same pale blue as Leary's, though faint cracks in her markings hinted at exhaustion. Her eyes opened slightly, landing on Ethan with surprise and caution. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice weak. Leary stepped forward quickly. "Mom?" "This is him," she said, her small hands curling around Ethan's coat. "The human who will be my father." "And your partner?" The words hung in the air like a sudden wind before a storm. Ethan's breath caught. He didn't know what he'd just walked into, but outside the voices were getting closer. And for some reason, turning back no longer felt like an option. The house in the shadows. Ethan stood in the small, dimly lit room, his eyes moving between the weak alien woman on the bed and the little girl still gripping his coat. The air felt heavy, not just from the heat of the small cooking pot in the corner, but from the weight of unspoken fear outside. The muffled sound of armored boots passed through the alley, each step like a countdown. Kelra, the alien woman, sat up a little straighter, her gaze sharp despite her exhaustion. Her voice was, but Ethan could hear the suspicion in it. "Why is a human in my home?" Before Ethan could answer, Leary stepped closer to her mother. "Because he's the only one who will help us," she said quickly, her voice trembling but firm. Kelra's eyes softened for a brief moment when she looked at her daughter, but her suspicion returned when they met Ethan's. "You don't know what you've walked into." "Human?" she murmured. Ethan didn't flinch. "I know enough. Someone's hunting you." Kelra's expression flickered. Leary looked between them and finally whispered, "They want to take her away." "To the camps." The words made Ethan's stomach turn. He'd heard rumors about those camps, places where the weak and unwanted were sold, broken, or simply never seen again. Before Ethan could speak, Kelra shook her head. "We can't talk here. The walls have ears." She nodded toward the curtain that covered the window. Ethan noticed a small movement outside, a shadow slipping past. Not the sound of boots, but softer, slower, watching. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry, and that was more dangerous. Leary's small hands gripped his sleeve again. "Please, you can protect her," she said quietly, as if her voice alone might shatter the fragile moment. Ethan took a breath and stepped closer to the window, peeking through a gap in the cloth. Across the alley, under the cover of darkness, a figure stood still, eyes glinting, watching. The house, it wasn't a guard, not in uniform. This was something worse. A bounty hunter, patient and waiting. "We've been hiding for weeks," Kelra said suddenly, as if reading his mind, "since my husband died. They think we're easy prey." Ethan turned back toward her. "And why did your daughter think asking me to be her father was a good way to fix that?" he asked. Kelra gave a humorless laugh. "Because a bonded human is considered off-limits to most clans. If they think you are mine, they might leave us alone." It made sense in a strange way, a desperate kind of logic that only came from living under constant threat. Ethan looked down at Leary, her wide violet eyes filled with hope. He'd spent most of his life avoiding attachments, but now, standing here with danger outside and this fragile family inside, walking away felt impossible. Kelra's voice pulled him back. "If you stay here tonight, you'll be on their list too." Ethan glanced at the door. "I'm already on their list," he said simply. For a moment, their eyes met. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the first step toward it. The night dragged on slowly. Ethan stayed near the door, listening for movement outside. Kelra busied herself with preparing a thin soup from what little they had. Leary sat close to Ethan, talking in a low voice about the places they'd hidden before. About how her mother had gotten sick after running for so long, and how she missed laughing. Her words weren't meant to break him, but they did, in quiet ways. A sudden noise outside made him tense. The soft scrape of metal. Ethan signaled. For Silence, moving to the door, the shadow in the alley was gone, but a faint mark on the ground told him someone had been here. Close enough to leave a trace. We don't have much time, he said firmly. We. Kelra asked. Yes, we, Ethan replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Kelra hesitated, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded once. Then you'll need to know the way out, she said. She moved to a small chest under the bed, pulling out a folded scrap of paper. It was a rough map of the district, with hidden paths marked in faint ink. This was my husband's, she explained. Ethan studied it quickly, committing the safest routes to memory. The moment was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Not loud, but deliberate. Leary froze, her eyes wide. Kelra looked at Ethan, her voice barely a whisper. That's not a friend. Ethan's hand went to the knife at his belt. He gestured for them to move toward the back exit. The knocking came again, slower this time, almost mocking. Ethan knew the type. Whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry because they believed their prey had nowhere to run. But they were wrong. Ethan opened the back door just enough for Kelra and Leary to slip through. The narrow passage behind the house smelled of mold and stagnant water, perfect for slipping away unnoticed. As Kelra guided Leary into the shadows, Ethan cast one last glance toward the front door. He couldn't see the face of the one knocking, but he knew those eyes, patient, cold, and certain. They wouldn't give up easily, and Ethan had just made himself their next problem. He closed the door quietly and followed the two figures disappearing into the night. The city was full of shadows, but for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was walking through them alone. The hunter's eyes. The night was colder now, the kind of cold that crawled under your clothes and stayed there. Ethan kept low, guiding Kelra and Leary through the maze of back alleys. Every step was chosen carefully. One wrong turn could lead them straight into the arms of the ones hunting them. The city felt alive with danger. Every shadow a possible enemy. Every flicker of movement a threat. Leary clung to Ethan's side, her small hand gripping his coat tightly. Kelra followed close behind, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. Ethan noticed her breathing was uneven. Not from fear alone, but from exhaustion. She was pushing herself to keep up, but her body was failing her. He slowed his pace slightly, pretending it was to listen for danger, but really giving her a chance to breathe. Then he heard it, a sound too light to be a soldier's boots. The faint scrape of something metallic against stone. He stopped, holding a hand up for silence. The alley around them was empty, but Ethan knew they weren't alone. Someone was watching, and they were close. A faint shimmer caught his eye on the rooftop above. In the moonlight, a small glint, like a lens, a scope. The hunter wasn't just following, they were tracking. Ethan stepped closer to Kelra, speaking in a low voice. Don't look up. Keep walking, but when I tell, you two run. You run? Leary's eyes widened, but she nodded quickly. Kelra's lips pressed into a thin line, her body tense. They continued walking, their pace slow and steady. Ethan's ears strained for the smallest hint of movement. The scrape came. Again, this time behind them. They had moved from the rooftops to the ground. Closing in, at the next corner, Ethan pulled them suddenly into a narrow side path. It was so tight that Kelra had to turn sideways to pass. Shortcut, he whispered, though he knew it was more of a trap for whoever followed. When they reached the other end, Ethan stopped and turned back. The alley behind them was still. For a moment, then a figure stepped into view. The hunter was tall and lean, their skin a pale green marked with jagged scars. They wore a mask that covered half their face and armor that looked both old and well used. In one hand was a curved blade, in the other a net with weighted ends designed for capturing, not killing. The mask's eye lenses glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light. They tilted their head. studying Ethan like a predator, deciding if its prey was worth the effort. Ethan's grip tightened on his own knife. "You're far from home, human," the hunter said in a low, woo-woo, distorted voice. "Not far enough," Ethan replied. The hunter's gaze shifted past him, toward Kelra and Leary. "Those two belong to someone now," the hunter said. "Step aside, and I might let you live." Ethan didn't move. Kelra took a small step back, her hand on Leary's shoulder. The girl's wide eyes darted between them. The air felt thick with tension. Finally, Ethan said, "If you want them, you'll have to go through me." The hunter's body shifted. A coiled spring ready to strike. Then they lunged. Ethan sidestepped quickly, grabbing the edge of the net and twisting it around. The hunter was fast, but Ethan had fought faster, using the narrow alley to his advantage. He forced the hunter back, limiting their movement. The curved blade slashed through the air, missing Kelra by inches. She pulled Leary back into the shadows. Pressing her against the wall, the fight was quick but brutal. Ethan's knife clanged against the hunter's blade, sparks flickering in the darkness. A sharp kick from the hunter sent Ethan stumbling back. They lunged again, aiming the net low. Ethan dropped to one knee, slicing the net apart with a single clean strike. The weighted ends clattered to the ground, useless. The hunter paused, breathing hard, their masks' eye lenses narrowing. "You're not just a traveler," they said. Voice low, Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, blade still ready. The hunter glanced at Kelra and Leary once more, then gave a low, threatening growl. "This isn't over," they promised before vanishing into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. The silence that followed was almost worse than the fight. Kelra stepped forward slowly, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "You could have walked away," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged. "I've done enough walking away in my life." Leary ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You didn't?" "Let them take her," she whispered. Ethan looked down at her, then at Kelra. There was something in her gaze now. Not trust, not yet, but something warmer than before. They continued moving, sticking to the darker paths, every step forward. Felt heavier, the hunter was still out there, and Ethan knew one thing for certain. Predators like that didn't give up. They waited, watched, and struck when you least expected it. But so would he. Only difference was, he had something worth protecting now. The road out the city had a strange way of swallowing sound at night. Every step Ethan, Kelra, and Leary took seemed louder than it should have been. The hunter's brief retreat didn't fool him. Predators often stepped back, only to strike harder later. The safest move now was to get out of this district entirely, and that meant finding a way to the old transport lines before sunrise. Kelra walked close behind him, her breathing uneven but determined. Leary, still holding Ethan's coat, moved in silence. Every few steps, she looked over her shoulder. She wasn't just afraid, she was expecting something to leap out at them. And Ethan knew she was right to think that way. The alleyways began to widen, the broken walls giving way to streets with old street lamps, most of them flickering or dead. Up ahead, the faint outline of a guard checkpoint blocked the main road. It wasn't the military. These were local clan enforcers, the kind who didn't ask for documents as much as they demanded bribes or blood. Ethan pulled Kelra and Leary into the shadow of a burned-out shop. "We can't go through there," he said. "They'll recognize me," Kelra murmured, her voice tight, "and once they see Leary." Ethan scanned the street. There was another path, narrower, winding behind a series of collapsed buildings. It was riskier. Less light, more cover for ambushes, but it was the only way to avoid the checkpoint without doubling back into hunter territory. "We go that way," Ethan decided, pointing toward the darkness. The passage smelled of rust and wet stone. Loose. Bits of rubble shifted under their feet, And somewhere in the distance, dripping water echoed. Kelra moved carefully, her long steps silent. Leary stayed close enough that Ethan could feel her small hand shaking against his coat halfway through. They heard movement, slow, deliberate. Ethan stopped, pulling them into a shadowed alcove. Two figures emerged ahead, both armed with makeshift weapons. Not bounty hunters. These were scavengers, the kind who stripped anything of value from the living or dead. They spotted Ethan first. Their eyes narrowing, the taller one stepped forward, blocking the path. "Nice coat, human," he said, voice dripping with mockery. "Trade it for safe passage." Ethan didn't move. "You don't want to do this," he said evenly. The scavenger smirked. "I think I do." Behind him, the second one shifted his grip on a metal pipe. Kelra's body tensed, ready to defend Leary, but Ethan stepped forward instead, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. "I'll give you one chance to walk away," he said quietly. The silence stretched. Then the first scavenger laughed, a short, sharp sound that was all Ethan needed. A sudden step forward, a twist of the wrist. And the man's weapon clattered. To the ground, the second one hesitated, then backed away without a fight. The taller one cursed but didn't try to reclaim his weapon. They both disappeared into the shadows. Muttering threats they didn't have the courage to act on, Kelra stared at Ethan for a moment. "You move like someone who's done this before," she said softly. Ethan didn't answer, he just kept walking. The less they knew about his past, the safer they'd be. They finally reached the edge of the sector where the old transport tunnels began. A cracked stairway led down into darkness. "This connects to the old spaceport," Kelra explained quietly. "It's dangerous. The tunnels are used by smugglers, and worse." Ethan looked at her. "So is the surface," he said. "At least down there, we're harder to track." They descended slowly, the air growing colder and damp. The faint hum of machinery echoed through the tunnels. Leary clung to Kelra's arm now, her voice a whisper. "It's too quiet," Ethan agreed, and quiet often meant trouble. They moved through the dark until a faint glow appeared ahead. Ethan signaled for them to stop, crouching low, peering around the corner. He saw 3 armed men guarding a side entrance. They wore no clan markings, smugglers, definitely. A small transport sat behind them. Its engine still warm. If they could get past these men, they'd have a straight path to the old port. Ethan thought quickly. 3 men meant 3 distractions. He turned to Kelra. "When I move, you take Leary and head for that side corridor," he whispered, pointing toward a narrow maintenance path. She nodded once. Then he slipped into the shadows and began to circle. One of the smugglers turned at the wrong moment. Ethan was on him in seconds, silent and fast. The man crumpled without a sound. The other 2 reacted too slowly. By the time they saw Ethan, Kelra had already pulled Leary toward the side path. One of the smugglers shouted, but Ethan knocked him back into the wall before he could follow. The last man hesitated, then ran the opposite way. Ethan caught up with Kelra and Leary in the side corridor. Her eyes met his briefly, and for the first time, there was no trace of doubt in her expression. They kept moving until the sound of machinery grew louder. At the end of the passage, a faint light revealed a rusted door. Beyond it, the spaceports. Lower docks, but Ethan didn't feel relief yet. He knew the hunter was still out there. And something told him their next encounter wouldn't be so easy to walk away from. The betrayal of the spaceport's lower docks were a graveyard of rust and shadows once. These tunnels had been busy with traders and travelers. Now, the air smelled of oil and damp metal, and every sound seemed to echo forever. Ethan led Kelra and Leary along the narrow catwalks. Avoiding the open spaces where anyone could see them, were close. Kelra whispered, her voice carried a mix of hope and exhaustion. "There's someone here who might help us," she added, glancing toward a dimly lit storage bay ahead. Ethan slowed, eyeing her carefully. Someone you trust. She hesitated just a little too long before answering, an old friend. We worked together before the war. That hesitation was enough to make Ethan wary. Still, with limited options, he followed her lead. The storage bay was quiet, except for the faint hum of a generator. Crates were stacked high, and in the far corner, a figure stepped into view. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with skin the same pale blue as Kelra's, but darker markings across his face. His clothes were worn but clean, his hands empty, at least for now, Kelra. The man said with a small smile. His voice was smooth, almost too friendly. You're alive. And you've brought company. Kelra relaxed slightly, a small sign of familiarity. This is Doran. She told Ethan he can get us past the outer gates. Doran's gaze moved to Ethan, sizing him up in a way Ethan didn't like. And the human? Doran asked. Your protector. Kelra's answer was short. Something like that. Leary stepped closer to Ethan, keeping her hand wrapped in his coat. Ethan didn't miss the way Doran's eyes lingered on the girl. A little too long, a little too calculating. I can help you, Doran said, turning back to Kelra, but things have changed since the war. Safe passage costs more now. Kelra frowned. I have nothing left to give. Doran's smile widened in a way that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Then perhaps you can give yourself, he said softly. Kelra froze, her eyes narrowing. Ethan stepped forward, his voice low and sharp. Not happening. The tension in the room shifted instantly. From the shadows, two more figures stepped out, both armed. Both alien. Doran's smile never faded. You think you're the first. Desperate souls to come through here. People pay in credits. Or in lives. He looked at Leary again, and Ethan's grip on his knife tightened. Kelra moved subtly to put herself between Leary and Doran. Doran, we were friends once, she said quietly. Doran chuckled. That was before the war. Before survival meant taking what you can. Ethan stepped forward another pace. Closing the distance. If you were her friend, you'd help her without turning it into a transaction. Doran's smile faded for the first time. You talk like someone who's never been starving, he said. Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he scanned the positions of the armed men. One was to the left, blocking the only exit. The other stayed near Doran, his hand on a holstered weapon. Then Doran made his mistake. He glanced toward the main gate as if to remind himself it was locked. Ethan moved, quick and silent. His shoulder slammed into the man on the left before the alien could react, sending him crashing into a stack of crates. The second guard reached for his weapon, but Ethan's blade flashed, knocking it from his grip before it could clear the holster. Kelra grabbed Leary's hand, pulling her toward the exit. Doran stumbled back, shock on his face. You're making a mistake, human, he shouted. Ethan didn't slow. Yeah, he called back. I keep making the mistake of trusting people like you. They ran, boots pounding on the metal floor. The echo of Doran's voice followed them. You won't get far. They'll find you. Ethan didn't look back. Once they were out of the storage bay, they ducked into a narrow service tunnel. Only when they reached a safer distance did Kelra stop. Her chest was heaving. Her eyes filled with a mix of relief and shame. I thought he would help, she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. You wanted to believe he was still the person you knew. But war changes people. Leary looked up at him. You didn't let him take us. Ethan crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze. I'm not letting anyone take you, he said firmly. Kelra watched him for a moment longer than before. There was something in her expression now, not just gratitude, but the beginnings of trust. Still, Ethan knew that with Doran alerting others, their enemies might be closer than ever. They pushed on through the service tunnels. Every turn brought them closer to the spaceport's central dock, and hopefully Ethan's small transport ship. But somewhere deep down, He knew the hunter hadn't forgotten about them, and when they met again, it wouldn't be in the shadows. It would be face to face, and one of them wouldn't walk away. The last stand, the deeper they went into the service tunnels, the louder. The hum of machinery grew, somewhere ahead. The old generators of the spaceport were still alive, keeping the lower docks barely functional. Ethan moved in front, scanning every shadow, his grip firm on his knife. Kelra followed with Leary close. At her side, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. They were close. Ethan could feel it. The faint smell of engine fuel told him they were nearing the docking bay. If they could reach his small transport ship, they'd be gone in minutes. But the thought wouldn't let him rest. The hunter was still out there. Predators like that didn't give up until the hunt was finished. They reached a set of wide metal stairs leading up to a blast door. "This should open into the lower bay," Ethan said quietly. He pushed the door's manual release, and it opened with a low groan. The room beyond was huge, dimly lit by overhead. Strips of flickering light, rows of unused ships, sat in silence. Their hulls coated in dust, but at the far end, in Dock 7, sat Ethan's transport, scarred from old battles. "But flight-worthy, almost there," he muttered. They moved quickly, weaving between crates and abandoned equipment. Ethan was halfway to the ship when something stopped him cold. A sound, soft, deliberate, and far too familiar. Boots on. Metal, slow and steady. He turned his head slightly, scanning the shadows above the docking floor. From the steel beams overhead, the hunter dropped silently to the ground. The curved blade gleamed faintly under the dim light. Their masks' glowing eyes locked on Ethan. Kelra froze, instinctively pulling Leary behind a stack of cargo crates. The hunter's voice carried through the empty bay. "I told you this." Wasn't over. Ethan stepped forward slowly, knife in hand. "Seems you're bad at quitting," he said evenly. The hunter tilted their head. "Quitting?" "No, finishing what I started." Without another word, they lunged. Ethan met them halfway, steel clashing against steel. The sound rang sharp in the cold air. The hunter was faster this time, pressing the attack with relentless precision. Ethan dodged and countered, forcing the fight toward the center of the bay. Away from Kelra and Leary, Kelra crouched low behind the crates, holding Leary close. Her eyes scanned the bay. She spotted a stack of old fuel canisters and a maintenance panel nearby. An idea began to form, but she knew she'd need to wait for the right moment. The hunter's strikes were brutal. A slash cut across Ethan's coat, narrowly missing his ribs. He gritted his teeth, blocking the next blow and shoving the hunter back. "You're wasting your time," Ethan said. "They're under my protection." Now, the hunter gave a low, cold laugh. "Then you'll die with them." They clashed again, their movements fast and tight. The fight was more than a test of skill. It was a test of endurance. And Ethan could feel his strength wearing thin. The hunter feinted left, then struck right. The blade cutting across Ethan's arm, he hissed in pain but didn't back down. Kelra's eyes narrowed. This was the moment she darted from cover. Moving toward the maintenance panel, Leary tried to follow. But Kelra shook her head firmly. "Stay hidden," she whispered before slipping into the shadows. Ethan saw her movement from the corner of his eye. He understood she was going to help. All he had to do was hold the hunter's attention. The hunter pressed forward, driving Ethan back toward the fuel canisters. Exactly where Kelra wanted them. She worked quickly, pulling wires from the panel and twisting them together. Sparks danced at her fingertips. The old systems groaned. And a warning light flickered to life. Ethan gave ground deliberately, letting the hunter think they were winning. The curved blade came in for a killing strike. Ethan blocked high, forcing the hunter to lean in close. "Now!" Kelra shouted. A sudden burst of steam and flame erupted from the damaged fuel line. The hunter stumbled back, momentarily blinded by the heat and smoke. Ethan didn't hesitate. He drove forward, slamming his shoulder into the hunter's chest and sending them crashing to the ground. The blades skittered away across the floor. Ethan pinned them down, knife at their throat. The hunter's glowing eyes narrowed. You won't always be there to protect them. They hissed. Ethan's voice was cold and steady. Then I'll make sure you're never there to threaten them again. He slammed the hunter's head back against the floor, knocking them unconscious. Kelra ran to him, helping him to his feet. Are you hurt? She asked quickly. Later, he said, glancing toward Leary, who was running toward them now. Right now, we leave. They reached the transport ship and climbed aboard. Ethan fired the engines, the deep hum filling the bay. As the docking doors began to open, Kelra looked back toward the shadows. The hunter was gone. The body had vanished. Her voice was quiet but certain. They'll come again. Ethan's eyes stayed on the stars ahead. Then we'll be ready, he said. Pushing the throttle forward, the ship lifted into the cold night sky. But even as the city fell away beneath them, Ethan knew the fight wasn't truly over. A new home, a new life. The stars stretched endlessly before them. For the first time in days, Ethan could breathe without looking over his shoulder. The hum of the ship's engines was steady, almost soothing. Kelra sat in the co-pilot seat, her posture straight but her eyes betraying exhaustion. Leary was curled up on one of the small passenger benches, clutching a worn blanket Ethan had found in the ship's storage. They were leaving that cursed city behind, but Ethan knew distance didn't erase danger. The hunter had vanished before they could take off, not dead, not captured. That meant someday, somewhere, they'd meet again. But for now, survival meant getting to Haven's Reach, a neutral colony where no clan dared start trouble. It would be the first real chance at safety Kelra and Leary had in years. How far? Kelra asked, her voice low. 6 hours if we don't hit any patrols. Ethan replied, eyes on the nav screen. She nodded but didn't speak again. He could tell she was still processing everything. Doran's betrayal, the fight in the docks, the fact that a human she'd met only 2 nights ago had risked his life again and again for her and her child. Leary stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly. Kelra's expression softened instantly. She hasn't slept like this in months, she said quietly. Almost to herself, Ethan glanced over. That's because she knows she's safe now. Kelra's eyes met his for a brief moment before looking away. Didn't expect you to stay after she asked you to be her father, she admitted. Ethan let out a small, humorless laugh. Neither did I. The hours passed in silence, except for the steady rhythm of the ship. By the time the first hints of Haven's Reach appeared on the horizon, a bright curve of lights and structures. Orbiting a small moon, Leary was awake and staring out the viewport in awe. It's beautiful, she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. It's home now. They docked without trouble, the colony's port guards only giving a quick scan before clearing them through. The air inside the docking bay was warmer than the city they'd left, carrying the faint scent of clean metal and recycled oxygen for Kelra. Every step into the colony seemed to make her shoulders a little less tense. Leary clung to her hand, looking around at the bustling market stalls and friendly faces. No one stared at them here. No suspicious glances. No whispered insults. It was as if they could finally exist without fear. Ethan led them to a modest housing district, a row of small apartments meant for new arrivals. The unit he'd secured was simple. 1 main room, 2 sleeping alcoves, and a small kitchen. But when Leary stepped inside, she gasped. It's ours, she asked, looking between Kelra and Ethan. Kelra's lips curved into a small smile. It's ours, she said softly. They spent the rest of the day cleaning and setting up what little they had. Ethan repaired a broken heater in the corner. Kelra sorted through supplies, and Leary darted around the room, touching everything as if making sure it was real. By the time evening came, the little apartment felt warmer, both in temperature and in spirit. That night, over a simple meal, Kelra finally spoke what she'd been holding in. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said, her voice steady but quiet. Ethan set his fork down. "Maybe not. But I wanted to." Her gaze held his, and for a moment there was nothing guarded in her eyes. "You've given us more than safety," she said. "You've given us a future." Leary leaned against Ethan's side, smiling up at him. "You really are my dad now," she said proudly. Ethan's throat tightened at the words. It wasn't something he'd ever expected to hear. Not after the life he'd led, not after losing so much, but sitting here, with Kelra across from him, and Leary pressed against his arm. He realized something. He hadn't just saved them. They had saved him too. Later, as the lights dimmed and the colony's night cycle began, Ethan stood by the small window, looking out at the stars. Kelra stepped up beside him, her voice quiet. "You're still thinking about the hunter?" Ethan nodded. "They'll come again. Maybe not soon, but they will." Kelra's gaze didn't waver. "Then we'll face them together." He turned to look at her, and in her eyes, he saw the same fierce determination he felt. A silent understanding passed between them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building something worth protecting. Behind them, Leary's soft breathing filled the room. Ethan glanced at her one last time before turning back to the stars. "Yeah," he said quietly, "together, and for the first time in years." The word home didn't feel temporary. It felt real, permanent, a promise made not just in words, but in the choices they had made to protect one another. The past was still out there, waiting, but so was the future, and it was theirs now.